In other frameworks, the suggestion is usually that you start by thinking about what visual components your app needs, and then you structure your app from that. In Hyperapp, I find it's more natural to just add your features until the main file starts feeling too unwieldy, and then you break things out and create your structure as you go along. And usually, the place to start with is the view, so that's what we're going to look at here. I want to emphasize that I'm not going to be using any Hyperapp specific features. I'm just going to be showing some patterns that are useful in Hyperapp apps, but rely only on regular JavaScript. So the thing you want to be looking for is repetitions, like we have input fields here, that text inputs that look pretty similar. And another thing you want to be looking at is rendering logic, like here we have mapping of some rendering, and here we have conditional rendering. Let's start by looking at this repetitive input here and make a function. Let's call it text input, and it's going to take some properties, and it's going to return this input. Now we can just replace everything that's specific with properties. So state new item, let's replace that with a property called value. With target value is something we repeat both in this instance and that instance, so let's leave it in there. But the action that we call needs to be a property, so let's call that props on input then. And the placeholder is something specific. Let's get rid of that for now. And on key press with enter key, let's call that props on done. Now what do we do with something like placeholder? Well, we could simply spread the props in the beginning and then overwrite them with the other values we have. This way, pass in any kind of props and they'd get passed along to input. So now we can replace this one here, this with text input, means we can get rid of text. The value is still the same. On input, we can get rid of the with target value. Placeholder, we can leave it as it is, and we can call this on done and get rid of with enter key. And we could do the same here. We could have a text input and get rid of that one. Value we can leave. We can get rid of the with target value. We can leave on blur, but we can call this on done and get rid of that. Okay, let's try it. Entering stuff still works. And editing still works. Okay, next let's turn our attention to this conditional rendering here. What it's conceptually saying is, I have some content here, but I want to be able to edit it, so if it's in edit mode, show a text input for it instead. We could encapsulate that in a utility we could call editable. We would take some props, and if props editing is true, then we show the text input with the props, or we show some content. So we need to take content, and this is a common pattern. Is if properties object is given as the first argument, and if there's general content, it's given as a second argument. We can't actually pass any props onto text input. We should define it so it's only the props that text input takes. So let's be a little bit more specific in our code here. We have the editing prop, and the rest are input props. Then we can do this and input props. Now let's try using it. In the list item, we have editable, some props, and some content. The props are editing, which is state editing equals index. And the rest are all of these props that we wanted to pass to the text input. And this here is the content we wanted to pass to it. And now we'll clean up this junk. Now, it's a little bit of a shame that we have stop editing twice here. And actually, we could say that in editable, we add on blur. We could have that as a defined behavior. So we spread the input props, but we also add on blur to be input props on done. That way we can get rid of it here. Now let's try this. It works. Next, let's turn our attention to this map. We have a UL and then we map over a bunch of items in order to render each LI some content based on what we're mapping here. This is a great thing to encapsulate in a utility. We could call it a list. We would take the items that we want to map over, and rather than giving it static content like we did in editable, we give a property that's a function. We can call it render. We would say UL for each of the items map, and they map to a value and an index. We have an LI, and then what do we put inside the LI? We call the render with the value and index to find out. Now let's try this. So our section, a list with items that are state items, and the render, which takes the item text and the index to produce this editable content. And we can clean up. And everything still works. Okay, so these three utilities that we've made, which also depend on this with enter key and with target value, all of this is like view utilities. So we could just take all of that out of the file and put it in a new file, which I'm just going to call view.js in the lib folder. And all we need to export is this one, and this one. Now we're still missing something in this file. We don't have the UL, we don't have the LI, we don't have the input. So let's make sure to import those. UL, LI, input from at Hyperapp HTML. And with that, I think we're ready to go back to the index and import them again. Import text input, editable, and list from libview.js. And now the app is back and working. Food bar Baz. Hello. Okay, so when we're working on the other features of the app, this to-do item is probably not going to change that much. So it makes sense to break it out and keep it separate. To-do item is going to take some props. We want to make it independent of the state and actions. So let's copy this. And we'll say this is props editing, this is the props value, this is props on input, and this is props on done. This is, let's call this props checked, and let's call this props on toggle. Let's call this one props on edit. And guess what? We can reuse props checked here too, props value, and here's a new one, props on delete. This way, to-do item doesn't need to know anything about the state or the actions. We can pass all that to it as props. This to-do item with some props, which are value, state items index editing state editing is equal to index. And we had another one we had checked, which is state done index. And then we had a whole bunch of actions. We had on edit, which was start editing index. We had on input, which is input editing. We had on done, which was stop editing. Oh, we have an error here. I think I forgot a comma. We had on toggle, which was toggle done index, and we had on delete, which was delete index. And we can get rid of this now, and it should all be working. Toggle, edit, and delete. All works. Let's do the same for the new item entry here. Value on input. Undone, and we can use the same undone here. So now we can replace all of this with add item, value, state new item, on input, input new item, undone, add item. And that's all we need for that one. Still works. And the button too. Yep, we should actually move these views into their own files, because as we add new features, they're just in the way. So let's put to do item in here. We can export it as a default because we're not going to be exporting anything else. But we need to import editable from libview.js, and we also need to import input, span, text, and button from @Hyperapp.html. And now the index we can import it from import to do item from to do item.js. And the same thing can be done with add item. A new file, add item.js. Export default. We need import text input from libview.js, and we need import button from @Hyperapp.html and text. Okay. And back to index. Import this as well. Import add item from add item.js. And we can see there's a whole bunch of things we could remove that are no longer used in this file.